All right, folks, welcome back to Deep Thoughts. Today I'm going to make what's called the glossary. And the glossary is going to be essentially my take on all the videos that I've done in the first 100 episodes. Now, the show just simply came out of a mistake. What ended up happening was we had this other show, MK Ultra, which was strictly a radio show that went out on a radio station here, an internet radio station called KXRZ. It was a co-owned thing by my co-host Kyle's lady friend, and they just wanted new content, and so he came to me and said, let's do a show. I resisted for a little while, then gave in, and the show ended up taking off really well due to the broadcasting, the simulcasting on this radio station. So we did 100 shows. We're headed towards 100, and I wanted to upgrade the format of the show after we hit 100, and so I bought this camera at my local Fry's. And then my co-host, who actually looks great on stage playing Les Paul singing songs for Dr. No, decided he didn't want to be on camera. And so I was like, well, crap, I just paid $700 for this camera, and what am I going to do with it? And so the other thing was I was getting a little antsy about the fact that I wanted to cover subjects that weren't really appropriate for the MK Ultra show. And I think that they needed massive time, 1 hour to 2 hours a pop. And so what I did was I sat on this patio right here and recorded one episode. I don't think I wasn't even wearing a shirt, but it was a lot closer on the camera. And I let a couple of the most devout listeners that I had known on the outside that we were texting back and forth through Facebook. I sent them the link privately, and I said, "Is this any good?" And the first was on evolution. Oh no, sorry, it was on the fundamentals of the universe. Sorry. And I got back really good feedback. And so I can't remember if I released that one or not. Let me take a look at the count on this. It was only 19 views, so I don't think I let anyone actually see it. And so immediately I got a recommendation from Jared. He said, why don't you do one on evolution? And I was just doing like a Bigfoot anthropological study, just serendipitously bumping into it online. So I said, okay, let's do that. I've got a lot of my own thoughts about it. Evolution, which was our the second episode of the show. I always say hour, but it's really mine. Then I went back and re-recorded Fundamentals of the Universe, because the very first time I recorded the show, I didn't use a mic. And so the audio is very scratchy and very full of dogs barking and that kind of stuff, right? And so we have an extra dog next door because my neighbor is helping out a family, and they brought an extra dog over, so it's not familiar with the environment, so it's kind of scared over there, so it's barking a little bit more than usual. Just for those of you who are curious why there's an extra dog. So what I'm going to do is just very quickly give you sort of a synopsis of each one of the episodes so that you can determine whether or not you watch them, and you can find out whether or not I think they're good or bad, and whether or not I think you should see them. Now, I'm not one to say you should see them all, because I think we're all different human beings, and I think that you have different interests. So, believe me, I know that if you watched all 100, you're an unbelievably kind person and like-minded, perhaps. So the technically first one is actually the second episode, and so I'm going to talk about the re-recording. The Fundamentals of the Universe appeals to me because it essentially I do a lot, and I have done a lot of cosmology research, and gone down the whole Hawking path and all of the quantum physics paths and the general relativity paths, and I never was satisfied with what I heard. When I started studying Eric Dollard before the show ever existed, he reminded me of all the research that I constantly reference, which is basically all of the electrical engineers from Faraday up, pretty much to Steinmetz, which is one step past Tesla. And so this particular episode just essentially goes through some ideas about how the universe might be put together, some of the fundamentals of what it means to be an infinite universe versus a finite universe, and that sort of thing. So if you're into that kind of thing, that episode's for you. The second episode is on evolution, which is what I said. I essentially cover the missing link of man as it's been communicated by an anthropologist whose name escapes me. I don't even think I remembered it on the episode, but he essentially isolates the fact that the missing link is actually a gigantic missing link, and there's not really an association with the prehistoric ape-like man, hominids, and the Homo sapien, the way that the skull's been redesigned to be able to articulate, think, and see better, right? The third episode's on artificial intelligence. The thrust of this episode is that we're being freaked out that AI is off the chain and that it's capable of doing all these things that even to this day it can't. And so what I really try to do is kind of get you oriented on where AI is, where it could go, where it could tap in, and already that episode has predicted things that Elon Musk has made true with a lot of other people. Again, a lot of it's just preying on people's fears is what it really is, because if you don't have a background in AI at all, you might believe it can do a lot more than it can. Plus, talk is cheap, right? So there's been a lot of talk about what AI can do, and it's never been proven, right? The fourth episode is one of my favorites of all time, which is called Why We Believe, and it really gets into the fundamentals of how we get indoctrinated into religions of all kinds, right? But it talks about how we're raised on a lot of fictitious stories, at least in America, Tooth Fairy, Easter Bunny, Santa Claus, those sorts of things, and then Christian religion is stuck in the center of all that, which seems equally imaginary, except for that's the one we're taught to keep as adults. And of course, it's a control apparatus. But there's also value to it because it teaches morals. Even if it's not technically true, I think it has a lot of value. Episode 5 is about self-educating. And that's essentially sharing my life with you regarding my professions, because most of the professions that I am in require a lot of re-education constantly, right? So if you're a software engineer, for instance, you're going to have to relearn the languages as they upgrade. But regardless of what you know that you have to constantly relearn things. If you're an accountant, you have to learn the tax laws. If you're a real estate agent, you have to learn the real estate laws and how financing is done year to year, right? So if you are looking to improve your life, that's what that's all about. Episode 6 is called Reality Check, and it really gets into just sort of it was sort of an esoteric coverage of sort of all the fear-mongering in the world today. There's, I think, a little bit about climate change in there as well. But just try to make sure that you understand that you don't have to be as fearful as you are told you have to be. Now, episode 7, which if you run, we'll say it's episode 8 at the very beginning, talks about screenwriting, which is something that I do for a living on the side, and it just is something I believe that a lot of you can do. You just have never considered it. You never had anyone take you through how it's done. So I've got a lot of really good accolades from people and comments from people that have gone to plenty of schools and read tons of books about it, and they realize that I really cut through the chase. And what I'm bringing you is a lot of the mentorship that I've gotten from my writing mentor, who has done classic movies, and he's written over 22 movies and sold every single one of them, right? Episode 8 is called Expanding Your Mind, and it's really just about the esoteric nature of figuring out where you may have restricted your thinking and getting you to open your mind to a lot of the conspiracies that are out there. Give them a chance, right? Listen to them. You shouldn't be fearful of other people's ideas unless you're fearful of your own beliefs, right? As I always say on the show, if I argue with you about what your name is, you're not going to, you just think I'm crazy because you know who you are, at least your name, usually, right? And so I try to play that up to the point where you realize that a lot of indoctrination is in that camp, right? Episode 9 is about choosing rules. How do you form the rules that rule you? Because a lot of us are taught how things work. And as I always say on the show, truth predicts the future. So a lot of us have picked methodologies to rule our lives by, but they don't work. And so this is an episode about taking everything that you believe and throwing it out the door and slowly evaluating everything back into your mind, right? Very important exercise. Episode 10 I mention a lot, which is expressing yourself. Sounds a little hippie-ish, sounds a little, like you don't need it. But what this is all about is very, very important. It's about if you do not pick a way to express yourself, you may not express yourself the way you want to. Okay, and that may actually be to your disadvantage. So I suggest in this episode many ways for you to consider methods of expressing yourself such that you maintain 100% control over your fiber, right? Episode 11 is very important. It's called Thought Police. And there's a lot of you that have said to me, why don't you do a episode on political correctness? That's what this episode's about. But it also gets into the biology of lying to yourself, which is what Thought Police is all about. It gets into the bullies that we have, the social justice warriors that guilt trip you for calling a spade a spade. And so it covers a lot of sensitive subjects, and I use very acidic subjects to demonstrate to you that you do have thought police regardless of how open-minded you are. And so I highly suggest that for everyone. Episode 12 is a generic episode about communication, and essentially going through the ramifications of not being a good communicator and the amazing benefits of learning how to communicate. Episode 13 is called Truth and Denial, which is essentially the fundamentals of anyone becoming a truther. It talks about those that you run into that will deny everything that you say, regardless of the validity of what you say. And it really gets at the fundamental theme of life, which is research nothing, know everything, right? That's the people we run into constantly. Again, in my experience, I haven't bumped into a Bernie supporter that knows world history very well, doesn't know American history very well, doesn't know the history of tyranny, of losing freedom, of fighting for freedom, establishing freedom. They don't know anything about banks, right? But they're telling you how we should organize this corporation, which is our country. Episode 14 is called Are Chemtrails Real? Has quite a few views on it, but essentially go through all the fundamentals of chemtrails. Sort of debunking the debunking. Because I think a lot of us struggle with the idea that they are sprayed in the sky, that everyone that is supposedly green lighting these things still breathes the same air and probably doesn't have a pill that absolves them of this. But again, if you're usurping power and getting a short-term paycheck for it, your awareness of the world, meaning our politicians and government people, they can be convinced that it's not hurting them as well because they're already docile to the program. Episode 15 is called Good and Evil, and essentially goes over the principles of those two thoughts and the fact that we have to have good and evil in order to have a choice in the universe. And so, again, most people would define a fair world as a world that is all good. That if Steven Spielberg is born into a good family and has a good father that helps him make films, then you should have the same sort of dad. And I don't think that's what it means. I think it means that anything can happen to you, and it will if you allow it to happen to you. Right? 16 is called discipline. And obviously discipline is a fundamental force that gives us what we want in life, right? But I talk about my own experiences with this at great depths, of course, and the fact that those who are most successful in the world are very, very disciplined. I know that just sounds like obvious stuff, but give it a listen if you want to increase the control you have over your life. 17, I actually recorded once and recorded over, and so there's a brand new 17, which will be higher up and more recent in the count, but it's about cancer. And essentially where cancer comes from, the fact that it's a man-made disease, the fact that it's not natural. If anybody tells you that cancer is a genetic problem in your family, it just means that you're genetically weak to the toxins by which they expose you to. This is going through GMOs, fluoride, potentially chemtrails in the sky. It also talks about a lot of the alternate cures that I've actually seen my friends use to get into complete remission, to the point their oncologist, which is your cancer doctor, thinking that they were on chemo. And just remember, chemo hasn't been upgraded in a patent since 1989, and it kills 97% of its patients. Episode 18 is called Corporatism. It's essentially a walk through how corporations are essentially a tool of the banks to push forward their agendas and obviously control you from cradle to grave, and controlling your food supplies, your health regimens, your finances. And it also makes sure that you understand that corporatism is not the top of the pyramid. That's a very important thing. I believe I mentioned the film made 1975 called Rollerball, which I believe is the single most accurate representation of corporatism ever caught on film. Episode 19 is very interesting because it's called Gender Wars. And it's essentially about the assault on our identity as man and woman. And I don't think we have a lot of followers that are trying to blur the lines there, but obviously there are massive agendas in place right now, and it's just getting absolutely out of control right now to blur the sexual orientation of individuals and to essentially make bathrooms just a willy-nilly, whichever one you want to go into, you can go into sort of thing. I don't mention any of that stuff because that stuff wasn't an agenda at the time I made the episode, but it sort of gets into the fundamental assault on gender. Episode 20, I have actually turned off and turned on at times, but I turned it back on. It's about the economic collapse fear-mongering that was going on tremendously last year in 2015. They were telling you the economy was going to collapse. As I mentioned in this particular episode, I talk about a lot of the Wall Street and Bloomberg articles that talk about that it's definitely going to correct, but it will not correct until after Hillary Clinton is installed as president at the end of 2016. Now, obviously, at that time, we didn't really know that Donald Trump was going to be in the mix so heavily. So a lot of us are hoping that the establishment hated Donald Trump, love him or hate him, will get in there and sort of short-circuit their ability to do this. Episode 21 is a fun episode about do aliens exist? And it's essentially going through a lot of the theories of aliens, the empowerment that government gets from telling you that there are aliens, through back channels like the X-Files sort of theme in the show. And that if you believe that they have aliens in, was it Fort Patterson, right? That then you feel that they have this amazing power over you. It also goes through a lot of the hocus pocus theories that, integrated circuits came from aliens, Velcro came from aliens, fiber optics came from aliens, and I break down a lot of those inventions and essentially demonstrate, I think, that these were natural occurrences in research. Episode 22 is called How They Spy on You. I've mentioned it several times recently, but it essentially breaks down from my technical background, being trained by some of the best security programmers on planet Earth, how I believe that the internet usurps all of your data and stores it and cracks it, and it tells you about some of the laws you may not know that are mandatory on all data being transferred, as well as the Military Commissions Act, which forces spying, which is a violation of our Fourth Amendment of the Constitution. At no point can you violate the Constitution, okay? But they do it every day. Episode 23 is called Being Intense. And I just had a listener listen to this recently, and he said, the title just absolutely didn't appeal to me, but after I listened to it, it might be one of my favorite episodes. This episode came out of a personal experience of my own and dating someone who was really trying to chastise the fact that I am intense about what I like. And you need to know that when I'm with you, I don't bring up most of the stuff that I study and talk about on the show. In fact, probably most of my close friends don't know the show exists. It's just funny because I do not push it. It's not because I'm trying to hide it. It's just I don't push it. For those who do like it, they comment quite regularly. Episode 24 is one of my personal favorites called Dagger of Goodwill. It's based on a poem I wrote way back in the 90s that essentially called out the fact that some people in this world will take all that is good about you, take your trust, take your loyalty, carve it into a dagger, and stick you in the back with it, right? They prey on the fact that you're a good person, and they use it against you. So the main thing I wanted to get from this episode out to the public was that you use the term when you're with your friends. You talk about a business deal that goes bad, a friend that has a turn for the worst in terms of their loyalty to you, and you can say, I got the Dagger of Goodwill. And once you start using that, it really heightens your awareness to the formula that happens against us, right? The bankers use the Dagger of Goodwill. Politicians use the Dagger of Goodwill, right? Bernie Sanders may consciously or subconsciously be using the Dagger of Goodwill of giving you these Robin Hood formulas that never pan out. Remember, the president doesn't determine what the tax bracket is, but a lot of people that vote for Bernie believe that he's going to go in and tell the IRS what tax bracket they're going to get to collect at. Isn't that funny? Episode 25 is about Satan. I will warn you, there's a lot of foul language in this one. It's not for the weak of heart. And I also talk about essentially all that has been exposed from FBI agents that have infiltrated these organizations, people that have been in these organizations and defected. And they talk about the horrific stuff that they see, from the sacrifices to the worshiping to essentially the worship of the House of Chaos. They create they believe they have the imperative to create chaos, which then could be reorganized as whatever they want it to be. Episode 26 is probably one of my most popular episodes. It's probably the second most viewed episode in the entire series, which is the Moon Hoax. It's a 2-hour episode talking about at least stage 1 of all of my personal experience being briefed by 2 NASA engineers who, one of them was a prodigy kid that worked for NASA at 16. He has 7 patents with NASA. Both of them retired during the Mars project because they found out that we didn't go to the moon, and they simply didn't want to waste their life faking that we're going to go to Mars. And so they pulled out of the industry, lost a gigantic paycheck, massive accolades for the truth. So if you want to tell me these guys are lying, I will disagree with you indefinitely. Episode 27 is about ancient Egypt. This is really about all of the research that's come out in the last 5 years regarding the fact that we believe that the pyramids were gigantic batteries. We believe we've scientifically proven this. The history of the pyramids, the history of the Egyptian people, as Graham Hancock has discovered when he looked at the calendars on the walls inside temples and really deciphered month and year, he has them going back 36,000 years of dynasties, not 3,200 years of dynasties. And remember, there's just a lot of white folks out there at the top that will not allow you to believe that any other race other than white people are the ones that invented everything. Episode 28 was a result of one of our listeners really being concerned about me personally being a shill. And we just had another guy come through, and really I had to block him out of our channel because he was just hurling insults everywhere and not being, remotely mature about his comments. But he went down that road too. So shills is something we have to watch out for in the world. What I propose in this particular episode is that a real shill gets money for what they do. How else could they survive, right? When you see individuals have massive amounts of money to create radio shows, big LED screens behind them, or they have all this money to travel the world and talk about agendas, they always seem to sort of absolve the top of the pyramid from all accountability, or they seem to be misdirecting us. I think that's really, really where you smell shills. But unfortunately, people believe that shills are anyone that disagrees with them a lot. And so it's been a very powerful episode for folks. Episode 29 is how to get a job, which I know that sounds like something you wouldn't want to listen to, especially if you're employed. But essentially in my industry, which is several industries, I've done my time in the computer industry, in the art industry, in the video game industry, in the film industry, in the music industry, and a bunch of other stuff. There are a lot of thought processes you need to understand when you're getting a job. And if nothing else, this episode has I believe, a really good perspective on what your employer's thinking while they're interviewing you. Right? So when you're interviewed, you have to know what the other person's thinking. And I'll just, the basic is that they're trying to duplicate themselves. So I get into the mechanics of that. Episode 30 is one of my favorites, called Magna Carta. Magna Carta is obviously a document. It was created in about 1000 AD. And there's a great story about it, which I cover in the show. But it's essentially the founding document that gave man common law freedom, which became the Constitution of the United States in America. So we need to thank our European friends for that gift. And again, they gave it to us, nearly 800 years before we needed it in this country. Episode 31 is about energy. There's a lot of you that have asked me to do things about oil and solar and talk about the whole thing. Episode 31 is another kind of adult disclaimer episode because it definitely has me all juiced up and angry about the energy industry, the fact that they're, as Stephen Greer from the the Disclosure Project, really making a good point about saying there's not a single initiative in the world to find zero-point energy because the patent office says it's impossible. But it also talks about the false classification of fossil fuels and a whole bunch of other stuff. So if that's something you're interested in, go for it. Episode 32 is barely watched. It's about self. And that's essentially managing your identity and what that means. So if you want more power over your personal being, believe me, this episode has several gems in it, right? Episode 33 is something I've taught in the world several times over the last 25 years, and I still lecture at art schools and film schools right now. It's about creativity. And I've managed creativity. I've had careers built completely out of creativity, from writing to creative programming to architecture to film writing, of all kinds. And now I'm into virtual reality creativity. So there's a tremendous amount of value there for you if that's sort of something. Either if you say to yourself, I'm not creative, right? This episode's for you. If you ever wanted to be creative, if you want to loosen up your convictions for the left brain and get into your right brain, right? Episode 34 is the European Union. And I turned this one off and on a couple times until I realized it had value. It's been watched several times. It is essentially about the false promise of the EU to make Europe a better place. And it's now been in place for 16 years at least. And it's just essentially gutted the gross national products and gross domestic products of each one of the countries. It has gutted the freedoms of those countries. It has gutted its financial stability. So if you're in Europe, it might be a fun way to get some really basic things that you could repeat to others to make sure they understand that this isn't working out, right? You need to get back to your national sovereignty, your own money, your own culture, etc. On that subject, episode 35 is about money. And for any of you who know where money is made and the Ponzi scheme that is money, this episode talks about that Ponzi scheme, how it's made in America, how it's made in Europe. If you get your money from the World Bank systems, it's fake. It's completely fiat and fake. And I talk about a formula for replacing crappy money with a new fiat currency that is not gold-backed, but is limited in its quantity, like Bitcoin, which you never hear about anymore, right? And just getting us back on our feet. But it's a real great episode if you want to understand the fundamentals of what makes our world tick over, right? Episode 36 is about thinking. It is a very coveted episode for me because as I teach at schools and talk to folks, you will understand the difference between thinking and memorizing and repeating. It's a completely different discipline. So the gist of this is I talk about the fact that if you take a person who's won every single episode of Jeopardy and you put them in a Mensa school test, which is a thinking test, they typically will fail because it's about thinking. Memorizing every capital and every river on earth or every movie trivia piece is not thinking. It's just memorizing and repeating. But we often mistaken this for intelligence. Episode 37 is another huge one, which is left brain, right brain. And this is very important when it comes to the fundamentals of being programmed via trauma. And so I get into all of that. Enough said. Episode 38 is about waking up. And it's essentially for those of you who have already awakened to some of these conspiracies of how the world works, and you're trying to wake other people up. It also might help those of you who are like, hey, I just kind of got into this truther thing, and I'd love to know essentially what's going on and where I might start my journey. Episode 39 is about competition and some of the acidic natures of competition to really beat down the individuality of a human being. Something, again, that the movie Rollerball really talks to. It's one of the major themes of the movie Rollerball from 1975 with James Caan. So it talks about the benefits of competition and some of the dangers. If you're a parent, you might want to get into this before you throw your kids into a bunch of that stuff. Episode 40 is about tribalism. And this is a very fundamental episode that I think is extremely important, which talks to you about how we click into tribes, how we essentially are willing to spite each other to maintain acceptance from the tribe, the fear that is being expelled from the tribe, but then essentially the sunrise that you see once you can live by your own thought processes and not worry about what someone else thinks. 41 is screenplay rewriting. So if you like episode 7, episode 41 is a must because I get into things that I have never heard taught anywhere else, which is the process of rewriting a script. Episode 42 is an extension of the creativity episode called Being an Artist. And it essentially talks about not just, pencil, paper, paint, artists, but essentially being a person who can express themselves in a form that other people can appreciate. So if you are in need of creative guidance, this might be great for you. Along those lines, 43 is about perfectionism. Perfectionism is obviously a process of refining and polishing your creativity. So perfectionism is something that not all of us are great at. Even if you're a great artist, you may not be your best critic. And so this gives you a chance to develop techniques for perfecting what you create. Episode 44 is the counter episode to the Satan episode, which is about God. I will caution you, if you are a Christian and you're looking at this episode, I am not a Christian. I believe in its message, I believe in its moral fiber, but I am not a Christian. So it sort of dovetails with why we believe what we believe episode. Episode 45 is a fun episode, very long episode. Actually, no, it's not. It's only an hour, 20 minutes, about time travel. and essentially goes through the basics of what time is so that you understand it technically doesn't exist in an infinite fashion, but when you're a finite being with a start, a middle, and an end, we have state changes which create the desire for reversing those state changes, and we call that time travel. So it goes into a lot of the details about that. Episode 46 is my first episode on dreams. I have another episode coming up called Dreamscaping, but this is essentially talking about what dreams might be. And if you're into that, you'll love it. Episode 47, Making Decisions. Now, what if you have really worked hard to figure out how to control your mind, how to control who you are, why you believe what you believe? At some point, you have to use the knowledge that you have to make decisions, which equal what I call wisdom. And so making decisions is huge, and it goes through all kinds of disciplines of making decisions, which I think will make your life a lot better, hopefully. Episode 48 is oddly one of the least watched episodes. It's about giving. And the essentially, some of the most brilliant people in the world have constantly said you get back what you put out. And so giving is a mechanism, is an episode about the mechanism of giving and making sure that if you want to get back great things, you're going to have to put things out to the universe. It's not surprising to me it doesn't get watched very much. Episode 49 is all about war. The machine that is war, the benefactors of war, the manipulation of humanity to engage in war, the factions that are very susceptible to believing in war, and essentially calls bullshit on the whole thing. I also support our troops in getting them home safely, but hopefully making sure that we understand when we engage in it, it must be for a very specific purpose, right? Episode 50 is a very important one for me, which is called The Unknown. In the world, we get all these authoritarian figures that say, I know how this works, I know how that works. And in reality, we really don't know. We really don't know a lot of things about the universe, right? And so we don't have a discipline or a mechanism of discussion to really talk about how we don't know things. We have degrees in things called like theoretical physics, which is basically the unknown, maybe eventualities of math and how the universe works. And I would suggest in this episode that we have a degree in the unknown with certain disciplines. Episode 51 is the most popular episode in the entire series. It was my first introduction to flat Earth theory, right? Because it was very new to me, and I had my mind blown on a couple things. Again, the theory evolves so much that even in my most recent episode on the firmament, there are things that may be already resolved. So it's a moving target. But I'm just trying to get you to open your mind to the idea that it shouldn't be a problem to talk about this stuff, even if you believe it's round. Have some fun, for God's sakes, right? Don't get all upset. The next one is just a special report about the confession of Stanley Kubrick to having filmed Apollo 11 and Apollo 13. To this day, I believe that my episode's 100% correct. That is actually Stanley Kubrick. No one has claimed that interview besides the guy that said he interviewed Stanley Kubrick. There's been false claims that the Kubrick family has rejected the video. They have not done anything of the kind. They've published no statements. They've recorded no videos on it. And so I do believe 100% that that's Stanley Kubrick. And I believe he only did participate in 2 episodes. But I go through all the anomalies. If you've seen the footage and you want to lean on a bunch of facts that you think is not him, go watch the episode, and I will believe that I've categorically nailed all of these. And I usually don't say something so hubris, but I believe that's the case. 52 is very important because it's about talent. And talent is something that I think is falsely classified as a genetic trait only, and that you can't get it. If you're not born with it, and meaning if you pick up a guitar and you can't automatically play as good as Prince, that's not your talent, right? Talent is a misconstrued label on things that you end up doing first in life, which means you're better at it, right? If you listen to Prince talk about any one of his skill sets, for instance, he'll say, I worked very hard to be able to play the guitar the way I played it. And so in most cases, it's something you work very, very hard at. 53 is about the classic, sort of an extension episode to Thought Police, which is about bullying, right? I'm just going to say it's about bullying. That's all you need to know. 54 is about greed. And greed is obviously a flaw in the genetic desires of man. It is sort of this thing you don't need, but you think you need it, and it gets started really early, and it sort of destroys your life and everyone else around you. 55 is one of my coveted episodes called The Alien Promise, and actually has a ton of views, and I'm almost shocked it has a ton of views. It has over 440 views. It's essentially about the fact that a lot of us want to believe in aliens because we want sort of angels to fall out of the sky and take away the burden of growing up. And so I break this down to the point where even if aliens did show up, we'd still have to live our lives. We still have to earn a paycheck, but we also need to essentially suck it up and own our reality, right? 56 is the big pharma takedown. I worked in pharmaceuticals at a very coveted level for a little under 2 years, developing a very covert piece of software for the lead chemists at a particular pharmaceutical company. And I got to see a lot of stuff that later blended perfectly with what GMOs do, with what preventive medicine is doing, all the vaccinations and that sort of thing. But I also teach you about the moral fiber of pharmaceutical companies. For the same reason you wouldn't expect McDonald's to care about your health is the exact same reason why you shouldn't believe that a pharmaceutical company cares about your health when you're taking a flu shot, among other things. 57 is about disinformation. If you're starting to wake up, well, there's a group that gets paid over $1.5 billion a year in America called the Army Corps of Psyops. It's been around since World War II. They romanticize it by saying we're just convincing these commies to love freedom. But even if it started out that pure, it is now used to manipulate everything. For those of you who are Bernie supporters and you watched Hillary essentially steal the votes from Bernie, you know what disinformation feels like. It's hideous, right? Episode 58 is the Mission to Mars hoax, the Mars mission hoax. This is essentially saying with what we know about NASA and JPL and all the other space organizations, which now they're throwing SpaceX into this thing, the mission to Mars will be a complete hoax for sure. And it really heightens the fact that, look, if we develop the new rockets, new habitat modules, and a bunch of new software, we would test it out on the moon way before we would test it out on Mars. The reason why we can't go back to the moon is that we've never been there, and we would prove it by showing up with nothing there. 59 is a really funny episode that I did at night on this patio. It's called Ghosts and Demons, and it actually has quite a few views and quite a few thumbs up, which I was pretty surprised. I thought it was sort of a crappy episode, which talks about some of my personal experiences with ghosts and some of the, I think, over-dramatized takes on demons, but then, gives some validation to some of the things that people have seen. Episode 60 is a tough episode. It's about alcoholism. It's nearly 2 hours long. It has to do with my experience in being surrounded by alcoholics once I got to California, and essentially talking about the experience of how you can deal with it, how you might need to make a choice to sort of forbid yourself from being surrounded by people who are alcoholics, and maybe not in its purest form, but in terms of making them your lovers or what have you, it's tough. Some of you have them in your family and you can't escape them, so I talk about dealing with that as well. Episode 61 is about LSD and my couple experiences with the drug, why I believe it was banned, and what I believe the benefits of the drug are to your mind. Remember, Steve Jobs said LSD was one of the greatest things that ever happened to him in his lifetime, and a lot of you are benefiting right now from his perception on life, right? Episode 62 is about parenting. I've had it's not very watched, but the people that watch it and who listen to my audio essay back in the day, which I've turned all those off, I got some tricks up my sleeve that you might end up using to really engage your kids, to get forgiveness if your kids are having issues with some of your behavior, or they're just having their rite of passage issue. Episode 63 sounds a little hokey. It's got pretty good views. It's about loving yourself and the fact that you're taught not to do it. You're taught that if you love yourself, you're an arrogant sod and no one should pay attention to you. You're punished if you like yourself. Well, we need to get rid of that because that's essentially one of the keys to enjoying life, right? Episode 64 is a fun episode that I use an old book that was written, essentially it was a book gathered from the mid-60s to the I think the mid-80s about UFO technology. And so I just go through an episode of, if you and I were going to build one, what would it have to have in it? Episode 65 is about the CERN Hadron Collider. And there's a lot of talk about this thing creating the Mandela effect, potentially creating black holes. I dismiss a lot of that, but I also break down, I believe in layman's terms, what that thing is, how it works, so that you have sort of an idea of what it could be doing to the universe. It is interesting that the high-speed collision started in about 2010, and the Mandela effect really started in 2013 when he passed away in this timeline, right? Episode 66 is about fanboys. And if you're not familiar with fanboys, these are a lot of them are essentially public relations firms when they hire students to go out and essentially chastise anybody for calling into question the progression of innovation and technology and the world. They come in and they persecute you for having a different opinion about things. And it's essentially become a mechanism to keep corporations from having to take the heat for doing really bad jobs at what they do. Episode 67 is called Voter Fraud in the Bilderbergs. There probably couldn't be a more applicable episode than this episode right now, especially since we've seen, in Colorado, they essentially stole the vote from Trump and realized that wasn't going to work if they ever did that again. Bernie Sanders, again, not having any of his votes counted, but then declaring the winner Hillary. But it also teaches you who really runs the world in terms of picking our foreign leaders, which is the Bilderberg Group, which was formed in 1954. Episode 68 pays homage to Gene Roddenberry and the Star Trek series. The reason why I made this episode is that I believe Gene Roddenberry was onto something when he was trying to create a functional image of the future that we probably want to get to. Now, of course, the episodes are all full of propaganda from time to time, but that doesn't kill at all the overall message of peace. Sort of like a cashless society, completely cashless society. I mean, no one has any credits to get anything done. You simply are provided for, but you also have to work. Sort of the inverse of what we're being promised today by certain political candidates, right? Episode 69 is about gun control. And it really talks about why the Second Amendment of the Constitution was created. It's not for hunting. It's for protecting ourselves against tyranny. And essentially gives someone who doesn't use guns a perspective of what it's like to use them and gain confidence from them. But it also dispels some of the rumors about once you actually have one, how you should behave. It's not very preachy. Episode 70 is about love. It's not about how to get a girl or get a boy. It's about the absolute fundamentals of what love is, which I essentially boil down to purpose. When you find purpose, you find love. But it's much deeper than that, right? Episode 71 is actually a very watched episode about depopulation. So it talks about all of the techniques they're using to depopulate us, from indoctrinating us to reject our gender so that we don't have babies because we're all introverted into our own sex. It talks about all the poisons and toxins that are shortening our lives, from chemtrails to vaccinations to everything. Episode 72 is another massively watched episode about the Mandela effect. Essentially introduces you to the theory that we believe now that either the universe is very organic and we simply have never noticed because the internet wasn't around to compare notes, or perhaps the higher end theory that CERN Hadron Collider is puncturing reality as we know it and rewriting history. I know that sounds hard to believe, but listen to the episode. Episode 73 is about the 80s, and it just essentially recalls to you the majestic nature of the 80s, maybe some of the silly things about the 80s, but really calling to the forefront the idea that the 80s was essentially the last reign of America. People were happy. They weren't dark. They weren't trying to be grungy. Privileged white kids weren't trying to dress like they were homeless. We didn't have emo or goth much, if any. But if you grew up through the 80s, you'll love that episode. Episode 74 is about education. And I believe this episode really gets into the Prussian education system, gets you into essentially how we're brought information and what you can do to make sure that the integrity of what you teach yourself is at the utmost validated level, right? 75 is about networking. And for those of you who aren't familiar with that term, it's about living a life such that you meet a bunch of people and you help people find people. You help yourself find people. You help find people that will find you jobs, because it's essentially the way that we used to run our lives, right? If you were a blacksmith and someone had a conversation with someone who needs horseshoes, they would hook you up. You'd say, my buddy over there is the greatest blacksmith on planet Earth, even if you weren't. But that's the way LA works in a very, very big way. And I talk about the difference between living in the San Francisco area, where it is absolutely the antithesis of networking. It's very dog-eat-dog. They essentially work very hard to make sure you never meet anyone. It's a really weird thing. And LA is completely the opposite. Oddly, they accuse LA of being the opposite, which is really weird. Episode 76 is very important to me, which is the post-PC era, which is this line of bullshit to make sure everyone carries a cell phone with them, and that you essentially have your destiny cut short because you will no longer endorse the purchase of a PC, a desktop computer at your house that allows you to do things that people in Hollywood and television and music actually do, which is use a computer to do professional things. It is the kiss of death if you buy into it. If you pat yourself on the back that you don't own a desktop, believe me, you're patting yourself on the back for having your legs cut off. 77 is about ego. It goes as deep as Freud, and it goes up to where you can actually have some ego and use it for your life, because it is a very important thing you must be in touch with. It's probably an extension from the self episode. Episode 76 is about revolution, about what that word means. What does it mean to have a revolution? Does it mean guns and death everywhere, or does it mean essentially a consciousness? It also helps you understand that when you have a revolution, you must have a finish line that you define, because if you don't, someone else will get in there, put up a false win, a false finish line, and you'll stop your revolution before you finish, and therefore you will not accomplish what you need to accomplish. Since revolutions are very, very rare in society, whether they be mental or physical, you have to make sure that we get what we want before it's over, right? 79 was sort of a weird mistake. It's called The Answer, and it really talks about what is the purpose of life, the meaning of life, as Douglas Adams would say. I think is one of my favorite episodes personally, because it just essentially calls out that what we're trying to do is live, and what does that mean, right? The next episode up, 80, is called The Origins of Man, which is sort of an extension from The Answer, but what it really talks about is that we probably will never find out in our lifetime, save some miraculous uncovering of some tomes of truth that we can validate and prove to ourselves. We may never find out who we are as a man, as Homo sapiens, and we have to learn to deal with that, right? Episode 81 is about transhumanism. For those of you who haven't heard about this, it's every piece of science that's going to invade the human body, invade the human mind, that will become a permanent component of your body, that will perhaps extend life in one realm, but take away the essence of man in the other realm. It's more fascinating than you might imagine. Episode 82 is an episode that I struggled with recording for months in terms of actually doing it. It's about suicide. I had a run-in where I went through a suicidal phase in my life in my early 20s. It's sort of a silly thing. I think one of our listeners has proven that what I was trying to do wouldn't have worked anyway. But I share my own kind of going to the edge of life and essentially receiving a message at the apex of doing such a thing. And I try to essentially, talk you off the ledge using very basic things that will give you encouragement if you think you've reached rock bottom. And even though I never had a suicidal thought after that moment, I definitely have been through peaks and valleys because of economic booms and busts. I've had my destiny destroyed by the bankers more than 3 times in my lifetime, like big multi-million-dollar situations that were simply stopped by the economy. But we all have to work together to keep ourselves, afloat, because there's something special that you're about to do that you haven't done yet. And you got to stick around and make it happen, right? Episode 83 is about politics. And this is essentially taking you through, it's a fairly long episode, but it takes you through the evolution of politics as it would exist if you and I found ourselves stranded on an island with a bunch of other survivors from a boat wreck. And I paint the timeline of how that would develop organically, and how the power structures that we have today would develop organically, probably out of no malice towards man, and then maybe getting to the point where power corrupts the individual's absolute, right? Very powerful for today. Episode 84 is about everything. It's sort of a weird title, and it's probably not the best title I could have given it, but it has a lot of thumbs up and a lot of positive comments. And it's essentially about my friends that are waking up and they feel like everything sucks. And they have a problem going to bed at night. And I give you mechanisms to sleep like a baby. Let's just put it that way. So if you found yourself in that state of mind, episode 84 is for you. Episode 85, another one of these personal improvement things. It's called time management. Now, time is the only enemy that we really have in the world. It really is. You know, we live a finite life. I do believe in reincarnation, but at the same time, we want to make sure that we get as much done as we can on our mortal coils, right? So this is me sharing with you the mechanisms by which I manage time, all the way from how to get up in the morning and go through your bathroom ritual to planning out your life until you're dead and making sure that you understand what you're doing. Episode 86, one of my favorite episodes, called Law of Attraction. This is about a re-engineering of what that means. If you've never heard that phrase before, this is about how you can dial into the frequency of getting what you want out of life and getting it. But it also undoes a lot of, I think, the false guidance that we have from the world to, what I want to say, to stop thinking that really understanding where you are gets you to the next place that you want to be. Because the more that you get into where you are, the more you're dialing into the frequency of the past. I want you to disengage and disavow and ignore anything that you don't want in life, and I help you refocus on the things that you want exclusively. So you have no other thought but what you want, and the universe will take care of the rest, right? The next one's a special report on the Mandela Effect, essentially part 2, where I learned some amazing things that blew my mind that I am definitely, positively sure were different in my past. It's had quite a few views, about 700 views. So if you're into the Mandela Effect, this is a must for you. How's that for a sales pitch? 87 is about predictive programming. This was, as a suggested from one of our listeners. Predictive programming is a wide range of things, from people predicting crime to people predicting what's going to happen in the future, right? Now, there's a whole other wing I could do on predictive programming, which is essentially when cartoons on TV show you things that are about to occur, right? Like Family Guy, essentially doing an episode about the Boston bombing before it happens, The Simpsons talking about 9/11 before it happens, all that kind of stuff, right? But if you're into that, get into that. 88 is about mind control and all of the mechanisms by which I have learned that you can be controlled. That's basically all that needs to be said there. 89 is essentially for the artists, for those who are physically creating art. It's a small tour through some of my ancient artwork and sort of my development. It's a video only. All right. So if you're coming through podcasting, you're not going to be able to see listen to episode 89 because there's just simply too much art I'm referring to. It would be a pointless podcast. So if you haven't got on YouTube, that's episode that's waiting for you. The next one up was a special report tribute to Prince. That's all I'm going to say. Episode 90, I will probably re-record in the near future about virtual reality, but essentially it was my first take on virtual reality, and talks about a lot of the technologies, talks about sort of the fundamentals of what virtual reality is, the explosion of it in the early 90s, and what it's turned out to be in this 21st century. I will go back and re-record it to update all of the tech I mentioned. I actually made the wrong mention of one of the devices I called the HTC Vive, a Valve, because someone mentioned it to me wrong, and I carried it forward like an idiot. 91 is the second class of Law of Attraction, which is called dreamscaping. And what's really weird about this dreamscaping episode is that within my since the time that I made the episode, I have bumped into a bunch of people that were struggling to explain to me exactly what I said in this episode without them listening to the episode. And it's essentially that we believe that dreams are a gift that you can use to move from your reality of wherever you are to the one that you want to wake up into. Episode 92 is extremely important right now, which is called the Stockholm Syndrome. It's about the fact that we get brainwashed into institutions that are doing us no good. They become our captors, but because we don't have the courage to admit we were wrong, even to ourselves, we end up keep propagating up horrible political movements, brand loyalties, and all that kind of stuff. Episode 93 is about integrity. And it's just essentially defining it for you, making sure that you have some, and giving you tools to essentially gain a little bit of pride within yourself for who you are. 94 is about all the double standards in life, about how we double speak ourselves. It's sort of an extension of the Thought Police episode. Episode 95 is about subspecies, which is sort of an esoteric title, but what it talks about is the fact that those that rule the world currently, that we allow to do this job poorly, are essentially working overtime to make sure that we split up into two genetic and mental species, one that will tell the other what to do. And we need to halt this as quickly as humanly possible. Episode 96 is about morality. Where does it come from in a secular world with no religion? How do we distill it out of religion but leave the hocus pocus stuff behind? And what do we do with any change to the cultural mean of society that it goes unchecked, right? We make a big change and we say, oh, now we're willing to say dirty words on television. We're willing to download, porn into grade schools. What is that? What happens if it goes unchecked? If any one of those things that we allow, that we pat ourselves on the back for being free, where's it going to go if we don't check it, right? So that's what that's about. 97 is an homage to the past days of coin-op arcades, when you walk in and used to put a quarter in a machine and have an incredible experience in a room that was like nothing else on planet Earth. For those of you who grew up through the arcade era, you're loving it. And for those of you who haven't experienced, I hope you can find one in your hometown. 98, which just came out, is about the firmament, and it's essentially Flat Earth Part 2. I wasn't going to do it, but I found enough things that blew my mind, and I mentioned some things that, again, may not pan out, that may be explained away. But how else are you going to talk about something that we don't know? If you're going to win some, lose some, right? 99, which is not published at the current moment of this episode, is going to be about reinventing yourself. And it's essentially, it's something I think you should listen to if you haven't quite settled on who you are as an individual, which I don't think anyone should settle on who you are. It doesn't mean you're making broad strokes. It's just, a little fine tuning here and there. But maybe you do have some desires to really improve who you are, which is the only reason why you would do it. But it breaks the whole episode down into mental, physical, and spiritual existence and the tuning therein. So I'm going to make this episode 100, right? This is going to be about what all those other episodes are about. I've got tons in the queue again. God dang it, right? So if you made it to the end of this, now you know all of the episodes, sort of what I was thinking when I did them. Again, thank you for your suggestions, because I think at least 10% of these episodes were straight out of your suggestions. I would say that the best episodes are probably out of your suggestions. I struggle to compete. Anyway, if you dig this whole series, please subscribe. If you, I don't think you're going to like this episode necessarily, but you can find our whole feed on mkultraradio.com. That's all I'm going to say today. The motto of this show at the end is to take care of yourself and someone else, and I will see you in the next Deep Thoughts. Over now.